The insatiable appetites of dragons and men. I wish to dedicate the following tale to anyone who loves someone who loves a dragon. Long ago, in a small village by the sea, lived a young man who toiled much under the sun and upon the great waves of the deep. In his years of working, he had never seemed to find exceeding fortune, but he always had enough for himself and his family. That was soon to change. One day, while fishing in the deep, he came upon an island cave. Already his catch was great, and he had many hours to spare before he was expected home. A great curiosity filled him when he saw that lonely rock, so he came to the island and explored the dark cavern that rose from the sea. Water floored the darkness of the cave, for the tides were high. Soon, rock was all that was around him, yet he continued exploring. Near the back of that dark home, he found something of great wonder. It was strange to see, for he could scarcely see anything at all. But the thing had a glow to it, guiding him through the darkness. Alas, he came to it, and as his eyes changed with its faint light, he could perceive what was before him. It was an egg the size of a small child, not smooth like a serpent's, nor spotted like a thrush's, but rigid and black, like charcoal in the ashes of a weary fire. Veins of light could be seen through thinner parts of the shell. The light itself was being near the likeness of a flame, and while he had never seen such a thing, he knew what this was. Oh yes, stories do not lie, nor are they for lack of telling what this thing was, a dragon's egg. But the stories say dragons and men are not friends, and he believed this. Dragons lived elsewhere, far, far elsewhere. For when dragons of land and air came to towns or castles, they were hunted and killed and eaten for their great stores of meat. When the dragons of the deep were sighted, they were slain also for fear of their size. So most dragons, whether of land, sky, or sea, were treated to hidden homes far away from men. And if ever men went venturing toward those hidden homes, they were eaten, burned, or drowned in the depths, for dragons and men are not friends. But this young man, this well-fed fisher, he heeded not those old tales. He was filled with desire for this egg, desire to take it and to hold it, to possibly see what it would become, to watch a dragon hatch. Oh, how marvelous that would surely be. So he took the beautiful egg home, thinking he would return it, or rather the thing that came out of it, once the hatching had happened. He did not tell his family, but kept it safely hidden in his quarters. He gazed at it night after night, petting it like an animal, and speaking to it like a dear friend. He began to love the egg and dream of what it might become. And soon, the egg began to swell. Something within it began to move, and before long the thing would hatch. He was sure to sneak the thing outside his home, and he determined to continue to nurture the egg until it was hatched, only to see what was inside, just to see. That is all he wanted then. He camped outside the outskirts of his village, hidden in the forest, watching and touching his precious egg. At last, it hatched. The beginnings were great. Such joy it brought him to see this wonderful conception come forth. The first patch of the shell fell to the ground, then another, and as the egg hatched, he came close and tried to look within, just to peek at the coming dragon, but he could not see inside, only blackness. He slightly remembered the tales of old and of dragons and men, so he reared his head backward, just in time too, for from the place where that window was made in that black shell soon came forth a little head. It was black and scaled, like that of a serpent or a crocodile. But this was a dragon's head, a baby dragon. Soon the hatching was complete, and the rest of the body was nigh. The young man took such pleasure in watching the hatching. First that little head, then the neck, then the legs stuck through, and then wings broke the rest. Finally, a long spiked tail unfolded from the creature's snake-like body, and it was complete. It was born. A dragon. His dragon. His dragon? Oh yes. By then the young man could not think to depart from it, and to leave it alone or return it to the island. No, he wanted it, and the dragon wanted him. The little thing crawled up and wrapped itself affectionately around him. It was warm and sweet, and looked up at the young man with gleaming red eyes. It remembered his nurturing voice, his gentle touch from before it was born. And now that it had come into the world, it knew the man, and the man knew it. The two were companions, and a great friendship was beginning, or merely being continued. The young man knew he could not stay at his camp, nor could he return home where other eyes would see his little treasure. So he left his village, he left his trade, he left his family. In the process of time, he abandoned everything he once knew out of love for this dragon. A fishing village would never accept his new friend. His family would never allow such a thing in their home. But he loved this little dragon, so he would be banished right with it. And he loved it enough, and wanted it secret enough, that he dared not even have the conversation with his family. Perhaps they would not just reject him and his dragon. Perhaps they would take it from him. But it was his dragon, his precious dragon. He did not want it taken, and he did not want it found out. So he traveled. For years and years he wandered with his dragon. His dragon grew in size and cunning, and the young man watched him with wonder. But oh, did he ever have to feed this little dragon. And first it ate the fruit and fish that the man brought in. The man was a fisherman, after all, and he loved that the dragon would daily feast on his catches. The man loved that he could provide for such a dragon. What a thing, he thought to himself. What a precious thing. Before long, the dragon's feeding was routine. At first, it was just in the mornings. The little thing was very hungry whenever it woke. But soon, as the dragon grew up and increased in size, it felt hunger before the night and eventually during the day, so that the man worked tirelessly to provide enough food for the dragon. He loved feeding it, but it was tiring. And he began to worry if he did not feed it, the dragon would leave him. You see, the dragon had begun to stretch its wings more and more, and had begun flying during the first year. But it never flew away. It only flew in sight of the man, and the man kept his sight keenly on his dragon whenever it was in the air. He did not like to think that the dragon could go anywhere and be with anyone. This was his dragon after all, and he did not wish to share it or be without it. So he fed it much as it wanted, in hopes to satisfy his dragon and to keep his dragon. Alas, after years of wandering and living alone with his dragon, the man sat still one afternoon. He had not caught any fish that day. The land he was in was green, but it was only speckled with little lakes, which were poorly stocked by narrow streams that flowed from afar. The bushes did not have berries, and the trees did not have fruit. He sat worried for his poverty and his hungry dragon, who would soon wake from a slumber. But then, to his relief, he had a thought that would save him. The land was a pasture land, and shepherds' sheep wandered the area. A sheep. Oh, how his dragon would love a sheep. A celebration, celebrating his dragon's birthday, or their anniversary, or something. Of course, the man did not know when his dragon's birthday was, or when he had found it all those long years ago. For feeding that dragon and taking pleasure in watching it grow and knowing that he, the young man, was the only man with such a precious little dragon. Such things consumed his thoughts. So, he had lost track of counting the days and the years. And of course, this was no little dragon anymore. No, it had outgrown him. It was like a snake the size of a horse, winged with great wings like that of a bat and adorned with scales. It was beautiful to him. He had nurtured it, grown it, and loved it. This was his dragon, and his dragon would feast on mutton that night. And they did, the two of them. He had taken a sheep from a herd in the area, thinking little of being a thief, and had brought it to the dragon. It was quite the bloody affair watching his dragon eat that woolly birthday present. But the young man even shared in the meal too, eating from the remains of the corpse. This, however, turned the appetite of the dragon, for it had been raised on fish and fruit. Mutton was much, much better and tastier. So, the dragon refused to eat the old things that the man had brought him. Even when they left that country and came to the sea again, the dragon looked away from any fish brought and wanted only stolen sheep or hunted deer or things of that sort. Well, feeding the dragon now was even more difficult than before because of its selective appetite. At last, for want of its preferred provisions and for the man's failure to provide such with regularity, the dragon left him. His precious dragon flew up into the air and disappeared into the clouds without so much as looking back. It was a very sorrowful time for the man, but he could no longer satisfy his dragon's want. So while he was sad to no longer have his dragon, after a few weeks, he stopped missing it. Suddenly he had more day and more night. He slept longer and ate more and worked less and had time for much thinking and doing. Soon, he longed to see his family again, to fish in the ocean back near his home village, to live the life he once lived, a life before he had found that dragon. Yet he remembered well how much he had desired that precious egg and how much he had loved it. And now he looked back on such desire and love, knowing what he knew. After all those years, having a dragon was a great deal of toil. Even so, he had not felt lonely with his dragon. Yet now he felt lonely. Eventually, he came to laugh at himself, remembering the old proverbs and parables. Dragons and men are not friends. He then understood why. But after nearly a month, and having begun his long journey home, he heard the flapping of great wings above his head. It was distant and faint, far up in the sky, and he heard a screech and a roar, unlike the sound of any common bird or beast. This was a dragon, his dragon. His heart leapt for joy in his chest. His mouth opened with a smile of happiness and fear all at once as he strained to look. There it was, coming through the dark clouds above, black scales and red eyes, coming down quickly to him. His dragon! Seeing it again brought him emptiness and fullness all at once. Oh, he had missed his dragon. How beautiful was his dragon now to him, having gone without for many weeks. He waited for his dragon to land near him, and then he ran toward it, without fear of its great size, for it had grown in strength and stature in the last month. The man came to it and jumped into a winged embrace. He kissed its neck and filled himself with the shadow of love that it had once provided him, a love that had left him when the dragon left, but had returned when the dragon returned. He felt this was true love, for it was the strongest love he had ever felt for anything or anyone, or at least it was the strongest love he could remember feeling for anything or anyone. Soon the trouble came to him as had before. After a few months of delighting in his dragon's presence, He was weary for all the work it was to feed it. The dragon had grown to feed itself, yes, but it always wanted more from the man, preferring what the man brought, so long as it was what the dragon wanted. And it was in those days that an idea came to the man, a great idea. You see, he was excellent at fishing. So, he had settled by the sea and begun fishing again when the dragon returned. He would sell the fish at the market so he could buy choice food for his dragon. But the dragon kept eating more and more, and he could not bring in enough fish to buy enough to satisfy his dear dragon. Of course, the dragon would fly into the countryside and steal away livestock. But again, the dragon liked being fed by the man best, and the man liked it that way too. For whenever the dragon flew away to feed, he wondered if it would come back. So the idea that came to the man was a venture. It was to display his wonderful dragon to the world, to use his dragon to earn money. He could charge locals many coins to see the dragon fly and hear the dragon scream and watch as he embraced the dragon without any fear. This would surely provide enough money to buy his dragon whatever food it wanted, whenever it wanted it. This would surely satisfy his dragon. And of course, the dragon would no longer be a secret. You see, even in all his long years of wandering alone with his dragon, the man had never spoke of it, nor shown it to anyone. But then, thinking what good it would do him, he wanted the world to know. To behold this great and beautiful dragon, his dragon. So, he began the plans and explained it to the dragon. It seemed interested in the idea. At first, the man and his dragon would present themselves to nearby villages, and as they perfected their act, they would return home to the young man's old fishing village. Then he would finally show his family his dragon. The thought of it filled him with angst. Even with such a large and glorious dragon, even with the great wealth he would surely earn, even with all that, perhaps his family would still reject him and his dragon, simply because of old tales. Tales that say dragons and men are not friends, which the man no longer believed. But that was a future revealing. For now, he had only to display his beloved dragon to strangers. With that, he began telling people about his grand idea. The dragon stayed back by a great heap of rock in the hillside, while the man went into the nearby village to advertise his great dragon show. Some were interested, some were not. But one man stood out more than the rest. He was older than the friend of the dragon and spoke a word of caution to the man. He explained that dragons and men are not friends, and that keeping a dragon so close was dangerous. He told the man to abandon his dragon, to return to his family, to return to manhood, to shun every thought of the dragon henceforth for his own sake. But the young man laughed and jeered at such a suggestion, for he loved his dragon, and his dragon loved him. The old man pressed him, trying to convince the young man of the dangers of dragons. But the young man grew angry and nearly beat the stranger. He could have killed him, he was so angry. This is how he feared his family would react to his beloved dragon. Alas, the young man, the friend of the dragon, finished his telling of all who would hear and returned to his dragon's stead to begin preparing for their grand display. Well, when the time came, the dragon show was very successful. A great deal of villagers came and saw the man's grand dragon on display. It flew in the air, ate a sheep whole, breathed forth great tongues of fire, and let the man sit on its back. People cheered, people screamed, and people loved seeing a real live dragon. And the man boasted and gloried in knowing that all those people knew this was his dragon. Before the day was done, the man and his dragon had made a great deal of money, and by the evening the dragon was very hungry. So the man cheered and promised the dragon he would go into the village to buy a fair cut of meat for them to feast on that night. But his dragon looked unhappy and discontent. It stared at the man with plain and serious eyes. The dragon had eaten enough mutton for the day. The dragon wanted something new. The dragon wanted to taste the flesh of a human. The man seemed to recognize this gaze, though he had not seen it before. He suddenly remembered all the dragon tales of old and the many warnings that dragons and men are not friends. But he loved his dragon too much to think the worst of it. This was his dragon after all, but his dragon's gaze was unmoved. It was hungry for new flesh. What was he to do? Perhaps he could bring for it a human, maybe not a strong one, but a weak one that would not be missed, one that was pitiful and lowly and would be easy to draw away. As if understanding the man's thoughts, for the two had bonded together greatly over their long years, loving one another, the dragon stepped forward with an open mouth, longingly dripping with saliva. Suddenly, fear came into the heart of the man, realizing that perhaps he was that pitiful man. Perhaps he was weak enough to be overtaken. Perhaps he could be eaten and not missed. So, in a fit of madness and fright, he turned and ran. The dragon screeched and nearly laughed as it flew upwards. The hunt was on. The man thought to go to the road, but it was too exposed with little cover. He ran as fast as he could possibly run, coming upon a small strip of forestry. He was then safe there for a moment, but not long, and he knew it. He then thought of the old man from the village who had warned him. He had spoken of so many other things that the man did not comprehend at the time, things of hope and great wonder, and the man had it in mind to flee toward that village, to find that man and to ask him, no, to beg him for help from this trouble. But pride swelled in his heart, and he refused to flee that way. This was his dragon after all, and perhaps he could outrun it, or find an offering for it before it found him. So he fled from the forest and to the rocky hills, and he kept avoiding paths, for he thought his dragon would see and find him on those. But he kept an eye on them as he ran, for if he saw some lonely traveler, perhaps he could spring upon them and gift them to his hungry dragon. Yet even in the hills, and in the mists that poured over the northern mountains, his dragon soon spotted him from above. The young man heard that dreadful screech and the flapping of those great wings. He wondered what the dragon's coming meant. His long night of fleeing had made him unconvinced if the dragon would eat him or not. He still loved his dragon, and thought the dragon would surely love him. He knew he could not escape its arrival, but he ran all the same, hoping to get away from his dragon, for the uncertainty filled him with an increasingly dreadful fear. But he could not escape. His dragon found him and came to him, landing in front of him with red eyes gleaming. The man stopped and looked at his dragon, and realized then he could never get away from his dragon. He had desired it when it was but conceived, and had nurtured it with love. Then, when it was born, against his own thoughts, because of his insatiable appetite for his secret dragon, he fed it endlessly and loved it more increasingly. And now that it was full grown, the dragon was inescapable, and it proved to have an insatiable appetite for consuming greater and greater prey, and thus confirming the young man's wonder. Yet still, to his great surprise, the dragon came nearer and ate him. What? What did you expect was going to happen? Dragons and men are not friends. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. James 1:15. I wrote this story with a scripture verse, James 1:15, in mind. Listen to this tale again, but for every time the dragon is mentioned, imagine and realize it to be a man's sin. You see, I know men and I know dragons. The common thing said in this tale is that dragons and men are not friends. But I have now known many of the race of man who have befriended dragons. In fact, men and women who have done exactly what this young man did, leave family and life for their dragon, for their sin. It is a gross thing to consider abandoning the wealth of God's institutions, monogamy, parenthood, brotherhood, etc., merely to satiate one's own lusts. But the truth of that matter, and thus the very title of this tale, is that a man's lusts are never satiated, nor is his sin. The sin he so secretly loves will want him more and continue consuming his heart, his time, his wallet, until the only thing left for his sin to consume is himself. Did you catch what kept the man from falling on his knees before that old man, that evangelist in the village? It was his pride. The dragon was his sin, and he thought he could trust it, or at least deal with it himself. Sin is insatiable. It must be killed, and it can only be killed through humbly coming to the one capable of killing it, Christ. And those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Galatians 5:24. You just listened to an excerpt from my new book of Dragons and Men, a Christian anthology on the topics of sin and suffering. The full book is now available for purchase on Amazon and at patreon.com. Links are in the description.